Sit down. You're embarrassing your father's name.
The glass hit the floor before anyone understood what they just saw. It was Beck's glass. Old Beck Dysik, who has survived 4 assassination attempts and a stroke, who doesn't normally startle or drop things out of fear, who has sat at tables with men far more dangerous than anyone in this room, and has never once let his hand betray him. The glass left his fingers, hit the stone floor of the hanok, and broke cleanly in 2, and he didn't even look down at it. He was looking at the door. Every man in the room was looking at the door. Ha-jun Seo turned last. He expected to turn and find the server he'd sent for, the one who was already 20 minutes late, the one whose absence turned the annual whiskey tasting into 7 men pouring for themselves and pretending this was fine. He expected to turn and find an apology, an explanation, the particular face a person makes when they are calculating how much trouble they are in. What he found instead was Mona Okanta standing in his doorway. Not the Mona Okanta of Seoul House. Not the plain white shirt buttoned to the collar, the hair scraped back into its low knot, the careful blankness she wore the way some women wear armor. That woman, the one he tipped generously and largely forgot, the one who poured his Macallan neat without being reminded and spoke to him in full sentences maybe 14 times in 11 months. That woman was not standing in his doorway. This one was wearing black silk that fell to the floor, a neckline that made no apologies, and she was carrying a bottle of Japanese whiskey in her left hand, a Karuizawa 1984 that Ha-jun spent the better part of 2 years and a very significant amount of money trying to source, with the casual possession of someone who owned it for a while. Her hair was out, a dark halo of natural coils, full and unhurried, that she spent 11 months pinning into invisibility and now simply let go. It fell around her face and her bare shoulders, and she stood there in the light of the entrance and let every man in the room arrive at their own conclusions. Nobody spoke. Sung-min, who was 26 and never in his life encountered a situation that made him quiet, was quiet. Beck was still not looking at his broken glass. One of the Vladivostok buyers, Ha-jun would remember this later, in the unique way you remember things that become important, was holding a lighter with the flame still going, his thumb forgetting to close it until the heat reached him. Mona stepped inside. She crossed to the low table the way she crossed the bar at Seoul House, unhurried, purposeful, not performing anything for anyone, and she set the Karuizawa down at the center of the tasting spread with the precise care of someone who understood exactly what she was putting on the table. She looked at the glasses, she looked at the men, then she said, in Korean so clean, it made 2 of the men sit slightly straighter, without knowing why. "I'll pour." Not a question. Ha-jun looked at her. In 11 months, he never looked at her face, for longer than courtesy required. She was always peripheral, part of the room's furniture, the pair of hands that kept his glass from going empty. He looked at her face now. Her eyes were a very specific shade of dark brown that seemed, in this light, to have been waiting 11 months for someone to bother noticing. She did not look at him. She was already pouring for Beck. The tasting was scheduled for 2 hours. It ran 4. This was not planned. Nobody decided to stay. They simply did not leave, because every time a man reached the natural end of a conversation, Mona was there, not intrusively, not performing, filling a glass, saying something in whatever language that man happened to be most comfortable in, and the conversation resumed. She spoke Korean to the Seoul men. She spoke Japanese to Nakamura and his associate. She spoke Russian to the Vladivostok buyers with an accent so clean it made Stepan, the loud one, ask her twice where she was from. She said, Lagos originally, then Gkebrha, then here. Stepan said, that explains the Russian. She replied, it doesn't, actually, and moved on to the next glass. Ha-jun watched this from his end of the table. He stopped participating in the tasting itself somewhere around the second hour. He was watching her work the room, not the way a server works a room, and not the way a woman who knows she is being watched works a room, but the way a person works a room when they understand exactly what every person in it needs and have decided, for reasons of their own, to provide it. He watched her laugh. Actually laugh. The real version. Not the polished hospitality version he never once saw from her at CRA House. At something Sungmin said in dialect. He watched old Bayek lean toward her and say something quietly, and he watched her respond without hesitating. And he noticed Bayek's expression do something it almost never did in Ha-jun's presence. He looked satisfied. It was Stepan who broke the room. He drank past the tasting for an hour. He and Beck had an old grievance. A shipment, a route, a slight that compounded across 3 years into genuine enmity that both men were usually disciplined enough to keep contained. Tonight, Stepan was not disciplined enough. He said something about Bayek's southern corridor. Bayek smiled, the way Bayek smiled when he was deciding something. And Stepan's hand moved toward his jacket. The room held the stillness of 7 men who all made the same calculation simultaneously and arrived at different answers about whether to move. Mona was already moving. Not dramatically, not fast, even, or not visibly fast. The kind of fast that only registers as fast afterward, when you are reconstructing what happened. She crossed the 3 meters between them with the same unbothered calm she used to cross a bar, and she caught Stepan's wrist mid-reach with one hand. One hand, the way you catch a door before it slams. And with the other, she set down the bottle she was carrying so it wouldn't spill. Her thumb was on the inside of his wrist. She wasn't gripping. She was pressing one precise point, and Stepan's hand stopped working entirely, and he didn't know why. She said, in Russian, quietly, Sit down. You're embarrassing your father's name. Stepan sat down. She released his wrist. She picked up the bottle. She moved to the next glass. Nobody in the room spoke for 11 seconds. Ha-jun counted. Then Sungmin said, in a voice trying very hard to sound normal, Where did you learn that? Mona looked at him over her shoulder. She said, I grew up somewhere difficult. She went back to pouring. Ha-jun did not take his eyes off her for the rest of the night. She did not once pour his glass. At 2 a.m, the room was emptying. Cars arrived in pairs. The Vladivostok men left first. Stepan without looking at anyone, his associate with a nod in Mona's direction that sat somewhere between acknowledgement and apology. Sungmin left last of the younger men, and Ha-jun noticed him pause at the door and say something to Mona that made her look at him with an expression he couldn't read from across the room. Then the room was just Beck and Ha-jun and Mona collecting glasses at the far end of the table. Beck stood. He straightened his jacket with the slow deliberateness of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether the other man earned the right to hear it. He looked at Ha-jun. He said, quietly, in the tone he used for things that mattered, She didn't pour your glass. Ha-jun said nothing. She poured every man in this room. She poured mine twice. Beck looked at the table where the Kuruizawa sat, one measure still remaining in the bottle. Not yours, not once. A pause. You should ask yourself why. He left. Ha-jun sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the karuizawa and walked to the far end of the table. Mona was stacking glasses with her back to him. She knew he was there. He could tell by the precise way she did not adjust anything, the particular stillness of someone who registered a presence and decided not to show it. He set the bottle down on the table in front of her. He said, "You came." She replied, "You asked." "I asked because I thought it would be funny." She turned then. For the first time all evening, she looked directly at him, the full version, not the careful peripheral version she used at Seoul House for 11 months. Up close, in the emptied room, she was something entirely different from what he built from peripheral glances. Athletic and still, her natural coils settling around her face. A woman built with the kind of quiet physical confidence that doesn't come from being watched and approved of, but from knowing exactly what her body is capable of. She said, "I know. You came anyway." "Yes. Why?" She looked at him for 3 seconds. The look of someone deciding how much of the truth to give and to whom. Then she picked up the bottle. She poured 2 glasses, one for him, and then, for the first time, one for herself. She set the bottle down. She said, "Because I've been waiting 11 months for you to ask me something real, and I wanted to see if tonight would finally be the night." He picked up his glass. "And has it been?" She looked at him over the rim of her glass. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. If you're wondering why Mona Okanta came to that room with a bottle she never intended to open for Ha-jun, why she poured for every dangerous man at that table except the one who invited her, and what she's been carrying in her hands for 11 months that has nothing to do with whiskey, stay right there. Hit subscribe right now, because what happens between these two next will shake you. And the truth about what Mona actually brought to that hand knock on Friday night, the real reason she came, the one she hasn't spoken aloud to anyone, will change everything you think this story is about. This isn't just a story about a woman who finally got noticed. It's a story about what love looks like when it grows in the same soil as a debt that cannot be paid. And we are just getting started. She went home and stood over the kitchen sink for a long time. The apartment was the way she left it. The lamp on in the corner, the book face down on the arm of the chair, the specific organized quiet of a person who lived alone and made peace with it. She put her bag on the counter. She set her keys down. She stood at the sink and she looked at her hands. The bottle was in her bag, not the karuizawa. That one she left on Ha-jun's table, one measure still sitting in it, her pour and his never touching. The other one, the small, unlabeled bottle, the one her mother's contact in Port Harcourt prepared 6 months ago and gave to her in a brown paper bag outside a restaurant in Itaewon. That one was in her bag, unopened, intact, still enough in it to do what it was always meant to do. She opened her bag. She took it out. She held it for a moment in both hands. Then she unscrewed the cap and poured it down the drain. She turned the tap on. She watched the water take it. She did not feel relieved. She did not feel anything she expected to feel, which was itself a kind of information she wasn't ready to hold yet. She turned the tap off. She sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her knees pulled up, and she cried, properly cried, the kind of crying that has nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with something being over. She was 13 years old the last time she cried like this. She sat on the floor of a hotel room in Lagos and watched her mother pack their bags with the efficiency of a woman who knew that staying was not an option. And she cried exactly like this, not making any sound, just her whole body shaking with something too big for her chest. She cried for her father, Chijioke Okonta, who carried her on his shoulders at Lagos markets and knew the name of every person who worked for him and kept a list in a green notebook of every birthday in the organization, so nobody was forgotten. Chijioke Okonta, who spoke 6 languages and laughed too loudly and wore the same leather wristband for 12 years because her mother gave it to him on their 2nd anniversary. Chijioke Okonta, who was present in that hotel room in 2010 and then was not, and everything after that was the world arranged around that absence. She cried for the 13-year-old girl who watched it happen through a crack in a wardrobe door and understood, in the way children understand catastrophic things, all at once, with no cushioning, that the world was not what she believed it to be. She cried for 11 months of white shirts and scraped back hair, and 4 million won in tips from a man who could not remember the color of her eyes. And then, when there was nothing left in her chest, she stopped. She sat in the silence of her kitchen for a while. Outside, Seoul moved through the night the way it always moved, indifferent and continuous, uninterested in the private catastrophes of the people inside it. She found that oddly comforting. She got up, she washed her face, and went to bed. She did not go back to Seoul House. The first week, she told herself it was reasonable. She needed distance. She needed to think. She stood in her kitchen every morning and drank her coffee and ran through the sequence of the evening in her head with the systematic attention she gave to anything that needed to be understood. Ha-jun, at the end of the table, the bottle between them. The way he asked why, in that flat, direct way of his, as though he genuinely wanted to know and had not yet decided what to do with the answer. The way she almost told him the truth. That was the part that kept stopping her. She almost told him, not the full truth, not yet, maybe not ever, but something adjacent to it, something real. She felt it rising in her throat, and she swallowed it back down and poured his glass instead. And that was a choice she was still not sure she understood. The second week, she stopped calling it reasonable. The third week, she stopped Seoul House from calling her by declining every shift. The manager asked if she was all right. She said she needed some time. He said, okay. That was the thing about Seoul House. It was staffed by people who understood, at an instinctive level, that some information was not offered and therefore not requested. The fourth week, she started running again. Early mornings, before Seoul woke up, the Han River path, when the light was thin and gray, and the city felt like it belonged to her alone. She ran until her thoughts stopped narrating themselves and became just rhythm and breath and the specific physical mercy of a body doing something it knew how to do. She didn't think about him, or she thought about him constantly and called it not thinking about him, which was essentially the same thing with a different label. What she thought about, if she was being accurate, was the question he didn't ask. He asked why she came. He did not ask who she was. In 11 months, Ha-jun Seo, a man whose entire operation depended on knowing exactly who every person around him was, never once asked her a single question about herself. Her name, her history, where she came from, why she spoke the languages she spoke. He tipped her generously and forgot her the moment he left the room, and she had understood this arrangement and used it and lived inside it for 11 months, and she was standing in his emptied room at 2 a.m. before it occurred to her that somewhere along the way she had started to resent it. Not the invisibility. She chose the invisibility. She needed it. The resentment was something else, something smaller and more embarrassing. The resentment was that she spent 11 months in that room and he never once wanted to know her. She ran faster. She didn't let herself finish that thought. He noticed she was gone on the 3rd Tuesday. This said something about him that Ha-jun was not particularly comfortable examining. He went to Seoul House on the 1st Tuesday after the tasting, and she wasn't behind the bar. He assumed she wasn't scheduled. He went on the 2nd Tuesday, and she wasn't there again. He ordered his Macallan from a different bartender who poured it correctly and placed it correctly and was, by every measurable standard, doing their job correctly. And Ha-jun sat with it and felt the specific dissatisfaction of a thing that is technically right and essentially wrong. He did not ask about her. On the 3rd Tuesday, he asked about her. The manager said she requested some time away. He said it in the tone of a man who was going to say nothing further, regardless of what was asked. Ha-jun recognized the tone because he used it himself several times a day. He nodded. He finished his drink. He went home. He thought about the tasting for a long time that night. He thought about the sequence of the evening in the way he thought about business negotiations. Backwards, from the outcome, looking for the decision that made the outcome inevitable. He thought about Beck's glass, and the lighter flame, and the way the room went still when she walked in. He thought about Stepan's wrist, and the 11 seconds of silence, and the way Sungmin's voice cracked, trying to sound normal. He thought about what she said. "I've been waiting 11 months for you to ask me something real." He turned that over for a long time. Then he called Mr. Jang, his head of intelligence, and told him he needed everything available on a woman named Mona Okanta, currently employed at Seoul House, Lagos, origin, Jikeberha connection, age approximately 29. Mr. Yang said he'd have something by morning. Ha-jun said goodnight and went to bed, and lay in the dark, thinking about dark brown eyes that spent 11 months waiting for him to notice them. What Mr. Yang brought in the morning was thinner than Ha-jun expected. This was itself information. The men Ha-jun dealt with were generally easy to find. They left trails because trails were part of how they did business, how they established credibility in history, and the weight of a reputation. Mona Okanta left almost nothing: a visa entry, a work permit, a residential address in Mapogu that turned out to be an apartment registered to a subletting agency, no criminal record anywhere, no financial history in Korea beyond her Seoul house pay, education records from South Africa, University of the Western Cape, a degree in international relations completed 8 years ago, and then a gap of several years where she appeared to exist primarily in transit. Brief stints in 4 countries. Nothing that explained the Russian, the Japanese, the pressure point on Stepan's wrist, or the Karuizawa 1984 she brought to his tasting like she owned it. "She's not in any system," Mr. Jang said carefully, which means either she's genuinely private or someone cleaned the record. Ha-jun looked at the photograph in the file. Mona at Seoul House, taken from the discreet camera above the bar, white shirt, hair up, looking at something off-frame with the expression he never registered as interesting until she showed up at his hanok in black silk. "Keep looking," he said. "Where specifically?" He thought about Lagos, about the Russian, about her saying, "I grew up somewhere difficult, with the specific tone of someone delivering a true statement that contains, inside it, a different and larger true statement they are not yet offering. Nigeria, he said. Go back at least 20 years. Look for the name Okonta. Mr. Jang wrote it down. What he came back with 3 days later rearranged everything. The name was Chijioke Okonta. Nigerian arms broker, Lagos-based, operated the West African corridor through the late 90s and into the 2000s. Reliable, discreet, connected across 4 governments, and trusted by men on every side of every conflict, because he kept his word, regardless of which direction the wind was blowing. A professional in a world where professionals were genuinely rare. And then, in a single week in February 2010, the corridor changed hands. Ha-jun read the file slowly. He read it the way he read things, that required him to hold the information carefully before deciding what to do with it. Not skimming, not rushing to the conclusion, letting each paragraph settle. The week in 2010 was efficient, brutal. His father's operation absorbed the West African corridor in 5 days, eliminating the existing infrastructure and replacing it with their own people. Standard consolidation practice in the language of that world. The file listed it as such. Assets acquired, territory secured, minimal complications. Chijioke Okonta was listed under minimized. Ha-jun sat with that word for a long time. Then he looked at the survivor list. Standard practice to document. It helped with future intelligence, knowing who was left and where they went. Chijioke Okonta's wife. 1 daughter, 13 years old. Last confirmed location, Lagos, departing on a flight to Johannesburg. He closed the file. He sat at his desk in the quiet of his office, and he looked at his hands, the same hands that signed contracts and poured whiskey and tipped 4 million won to a woman at a bar, the same hands that inherited an empire built, in part, on a week in February 2010 that he never thought about because there was no reason to think about it, and he felt something move through his chest that he couldn't immediately name. Not guilt. He didn't reach for that word. He was trying to be accurate. What he felt was closer to the specific vertigo of a man who walks into a room he believes he knows and finds that the floor is not where he expected it to be. He picked up his phone. He did not call Mr. Jang. He booked a flight to South Africa. Gqeberha in November was warm and salt-aired and indifferent to him in the way coastal cities were indifferent to strangers. 2. Accustomed to people arriving and leaving to bother with either. He found the address in the afternoon. A modest house in a neighborhood of modest houses. Bougainvillea over the front gate in a shade of pink, so specific it looked almost aggressive. He sat in the rented car outside it for a few minutes. He was not a man who deliberated once a decision was made. Deliberation was for before, and he was past before. But he sat with it anyway. What he was about to do was either the right thing or a very precise form of the wrong thing. And he wouldn't know which until he was inside it. He got out of the car. He knocked on the gate. The woman who answered it was in her early 60s and looked at him the way people look at things that arrive without invitation. Not afraid, not welcoming, just measuring. She had Mona's eyes, the same dark brown, the same quality of attention, the same sense that looking and understanding were, for her, the same action. Ha-jun said, "My name is Ha-jun Seo. Your daughter spent 11 months close enough to kill me, and didn't. I need to understand why." He said it plainly. He had decided, on the flight over, that plainness was the only currency this woman would respect. He was right. She looked at him for a long moment. The bougainvillea moved behind her in the sea breeze. A dog barked somewhere on the next street. She said, "Because she is her father's daughter, and her father was a better man than yours." A pause. "Now leave my house." He left. He walked back to the car, and he sat in it, and he looked at the bougainvillea over the gate, and he thought about what it meant to be told you are your father's son by the widow of the man your father killed, and to know she is not wrong. He flew home the next morning. He did not have what he came for. He was not sure anymore that what he came for was the thing he actually needed. 4 months after the tasting, on a Tuesday in March, Mona walked back into Seoul house at 9 in the evening. She wore the collared white shirt, hair in its low knot, silver studs. She went behind the bar, and she put on her apron, and she began checking the inventory with the focused attention of someone arriving at a thing they chose, not returning to a thing they abandoned. The manager said nothing. He simply nodded and moved to the other end of the bar. At 9:43, the door opened. She knew without looking. She finished the bottle count she was doing, and she let him settle onto his stool, and she let the silence have its moment. And then she turned, and she looked at him directly. The full version. No peripheral management, just his face. And she said, "You went to my mother." He said, "I did." She looked at him. He looked at her. He did not try to explain or justify or soften it. He went. That was the fact of it, and he was leaving it on the table for her to do what she wanted with. She said, "What did she say?" "That your father was a better man than mine." Something moved across her face. Fast. Pressed back. "She's not wrong." "I know." The bar hummed around them. Glasses and low conversation, and the particular ambient noise of a place that had held 1,000 private conversations and kept all of them. She reached under the bar and set down the Macallan without being asked. She poured it neat. She did not pour one for herself. He said, "Ask me what you came here to ask." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "Did you know, before the tasting, who I was?" "No." "After. 3 days after. Mr. Yang found your father's name." She nodded slowly, working through it. "And then you went to Gkeberha." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her. He had thought about how to answer this question on the flight home and on every quiet morning since. He hadn't arrived at anything clean. He was going to give her what he had instead, because I needed to understand what you decided in that room, and I needed to understand it from someone who knew you well enough to explain it. My mother didn't explain it. "No," he said. "She told me to leave, but the way she said it, the way she looked at me before she said it." He stopped. "She wasn't surprised I came. She wasn't surprised you didn't go through with it." He let that sit. "She already knew you weren't going to." Mona was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very low, "She knew from the night I called her from Seoul, 8 months ago. I told her I met the son." She said, a pause. She said, "Then come home." I said I wasn't ready. She said, "I know. That's how I know you won't do it." The bar moved around them. Neither of them moved with it. Ha-Jun said, "What's your real name?" She looked at him. "Mona is real," she said. "It's what my father called me. The name on my documents is Adaeze. Adaeze Chijioke Okonta." She held his gaze. "He named me after his mother. He said it meant daughter of the king." He was embarrassingly proud of it. Something crossed Ha-Jun's face that she hadn't seen there before. Not softness, exactly. Something underneath softness. He said, "Tell me about him." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached under the bar and poured a glass for herself. she said. He carried a green notebook. He wrote down everyone's birthday. Ha-jun picked up his glass. Keep going, he said. They talked until the bar closed. This was not something Ha-jun did. He arrived at places on schedule, conducted what needed conducting, and left. He did not linger. Lingering was a form of exposure. And exposure was a form of vulnerability. And vulnerability was something he managed in himself, the way he managed it in his organization. Efficiently, without sentiment. Tonight he lingered. He sat on that stool, and he listened to her talk about her father. And he did not look at his watch once. He heard about the notebook, and the Lagos markets, and the leather wristband, and the 6 languages, and the laugh that was too loud for the restaurants he took her mother to. He heard about a man who believed, genuinely, that the world of dangerous things he operated inside could be navigated without becoming a dangerous thing yourself. He heard about what it cost, that belief in the end. He did not offer condolence. She wasn't asking for it. He listened, and he let it be what it was. And at some point, he understood that this was what she came back to Surrey House to do. Not to return, not to resume, but to give him this, to make him sit with what his father's decisions weighed, to make it a person instead of a file. She was her father's daughter. At closing time, the last other customers left, and the manager began turning down the lights in the way that meant the night was over. Mona untied her apron. She set it on the shelf below the bar. She picked up her bag. Ha-jun said, "I'm going to dismantle the West African corridor." She stopped. He said, "Not immediately. It's not something that happens in a week." He was choosing words carefully. "My father built it in 5 days, and I understand how he did it. And I know it will take me considerably longer to undo it cleanly, without more of what happened in 2010. He looked at her. "But I am going to do it. And when I do, there will be decisions I don't know how to make correctly. There will be things I get wrong." A pause. "I want you at the table when that happens." Mona looked at him for a long time. "Not as your bartender," he said. "I understand that. Not as anything I have a clean word for yet. I understand that too." She stood there in the low light of the closing bar, her bag on her shoulder, her father's name in both their mouths, the weight of 11 months and 16 years, and 2 glasses of Karuizawa between them. She said, "You should know that I'm not forgiving you. I want to be clear about that. Whatever this is, whatever happens next, it is not forgiveness. What your father did is not something I carry for you to be absolved of." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for that. What are you asking for?" He looked at her. For the first time in 11 months of sitting at that bar, he was asking her something real. He said, "The right to keep trying to be worth knowing." The silence that followed was not empty. It held things, complicated things, unresolved things, things that would take a very long time to understand and probably longer to name. It held a green notebook and a leather wristband, in a hotel room in Lagos, in a wardrobe door, in a flight to Johannesburg, in 4 million won in tips from a man who couldn't remember the color of her eyes until the night she let him see them. She said, "Ask me something real then, right now." He said, "Will you have dinner with me? Not here, somewhere I chose because I thought about what you'd want, not what's convenient for me." She looked at him. She said, "Yes." She left. He sat alone at the closed bar in the dark for a moment. Then he picked up his glass and he finished the last of the Macallan and set it down, and he let himself feel the specific, unfamiliar weight of something beginning. If you made it this far, Thank you. Genuinely. This one carried some weight, and you stayed with it. And that means everything. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because we are building something here. And what comes next for Mona and Ha-Jun will test everything that just began. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Ha-Jun has the right to ask for what he asked for? Or is Mona letting him off too easy? I want to hear where you land on that. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Bye.